POV, you're a cleaner for the world's 1%. You were a crime scene investigator for 11 years before the work found you. Not the glamorous version, not the television version with the dramatic lighting and the meaningful pauses. The real version, fluorescent-lit rooms, the specific smell of decomposition mixed with industrial cleaning products, paperwork that accumulated faster than the cases it documented. You were good at the technical work. Exceptionally good. You could reconstruct the sequence of events in a room from trace evidence that most people would have missed entirely. The transfer pattern on a carpet, the specific distribution of biological material, the things a room tells you when you know how to listen to it. What you were less good at was the institutional friction. 11 years of watching cases stall in bureaucratic systems, evidence mishandled by chain-of-custody failures, conclusions you'd reached through meticulous work getting overridden by decisions made in conference rooms by people who hadn't been at the scene. You weren't idealistic about the system. You'd stopped being idealistic somewhere around year 3. But you were precise, and the imprecision of the institution around your precision wore you down in a specific way that accumulates without announcing itself. The call that changed things came on a Sunday. Not a work call. A number you didn't recognize, answered because you answered unknown numbers as a professional reflex. The voice on the other end knew your name, your professional record, and the specific outcome of 3 cases from the previous year that you had not discussed with anyone outside your department. Before you could respond to any of this, the voice offered you a number. Not a salary. A number for a single engagement. The number was $180,000. You asked what the engagement was. The voice said, a room that needs to not have happened. You understood immediately what that meant. 11 years of crime scene work gives you a precise understanding of what it means to make a room stop telling its story. You also understood, in the same moment, that the voice knew you understood, and that the knowing was part of why you'd been called. You were not being recruited blindly. You were being recruited because someone had studied you carefully enough to believe you would say yes. You said yes. The room was in a residential building in a city you won't name. A 41st floor apartment belonging to someone whose name you recognized, not because they were famous in the conventional sense, but because their name appeared in financial contexts at a scale that made them, in practical terms, invisible through visibility. When you arrived, there were 2 other people present. One was a private security contractor whose function was evident. The other was a man in a suit who told you only what you needed to know. The apartment needed to be restored to a condition consistent with it never having been the site of anything. He gave you 6 hours. He gave you a kit that contained equipment significantly more sophisticated than anything you'd used professionally. You didn't ask what happened. You worked. 7 hours later, 1 over the limit, which the suit absorbed without comment, the room told a different story. A story of absence. Of an evening that had been unremarkable in every documented way. You left through a service exit. 3 days later, $180,000 appeared in an account you had established specifically for this purpose, because you had known, when you said yes on the phone, that this was not going to be a single engagement. You were right. The second call came 11 days later. The third came the week after that. By the 4th engagement you had developed a protocol. Not a checklist, protocols are too rigid, but a framework, a way of entering a space and reading what it needs before you begin. Every room is different. Every room has already started telling its story by the time you arrive, and your job is to interrupt the telling at the earliest possible point. Speed matters. Thoroughness matters more. The 2 are in permanent tension, and managing that tension is the skill that distinguishes someone who does this work competently from someone who does it at the level your clients require. Your clients are not ordinary people who have made one terrible decision. They are people who operate in a layer of the world where the consequences of ordinary decisions have been abstracted away by money and structure, and the decisions they make are extraordinary in their scale and their casual disregard for the frameworks that govern everyone else's behavior. What they need from you is not sympathy, not judgment, not even discretion in the conventional sense. They don't worry about you talking because they understand, with the clarity that comes from operating at that level, that your silence is structural, not a matter of character. What they need from you is competence. You have, by the end of the first year, worked in 14 countries. You have restored 14 rooms to conditions they didn't have when you arrived. You have processed, neutralized, relocated, or rendered unrecoverable a volume of material that, if it had been handled through the system you used to work within, would have generated years of investigative activity and multiple high-profile prosecutions. You understand the gravity of this. You understand it as a fact, the way you understand the specific gravity of water or the degradation timeline of biological evidence in varying temperatures. You understand it without allowing it to become a weight you carry in real time, because a weight carried in real time produces hesitation, and hesitation is the one thing you cannot afford. The moral accommodation happened over time rather than in a single moment. You didn't decide that what you were doing was acceptable. That's not how it works. What you did was stop applying the framework of acceptability to the work and start applying the framework of execution. Every room has a problem. You solve the problem. The people who created the problem are not your clients in any operational sense. Your clients are the people who need the problem solved. This is not a meaningful ethical distinction, and some part of you knows it isn't a meaningful ethical distinction. That part has been allocated a specific amount of space and no more. By year 2, you have a rate card. Not a literal document. Nothing is documented. But a structure that your intermediary, a man named Voss, whom you know only through encrypted channels and 2 in-person meetings at locations he selected, communicates to whoever needs communicating. The rate structure is this: standard restoration, $250,000. Accelerated timeline, $350,000. Complex classification, which means multiple rooms, multiple evidence streams, or material that requires specialized disposal, from $500,000 depending on scope. High-profile subject matter, which is a category you negotiate separately and rarely accept, begins at $800,000 and has no ceiling. You have declined 4 engagements in 2 years. 2 because the timeline was incompatible with the quality of work required. 1 because the classification exceeded your current capability, a situation you communicated to Voss with the specific precision of a professional acknowledging a limitation rather than a person expressing reluctance. 1 because something about the engagement, communicated through the secondary details Voss disclosed before the commitment, felt structurally different from everything else you'd taken. Not riskier exactly. Different in its nature. You trusted the feeling without being able to name its source, and you declined, and 3 months later you understood from information that reached you indirectly why the feeling had been correct. The thing you trust more than anything, after 2 years, is your read of a room before you start working. The read happens in the first 60 seconds, and it is almost never wrong. What the room is. What happened there. What needs to happen for the story it's telling to stop. The read is the product of 11 years of professional training and 2 years of specific operational experience, and something beneath both of those things that you couldn't teach even if you were asked to. No one has asked you to teach it. But the question of transmission is one you've begun to consider, because the engagements have begun to exceed what one person can manage alone in the timelines that are increasingly being requested. The market for this service is not growing because more events are occurring. It is growing because the class of people who need the service is expanding its understanding of what can be managed. What can be made to not have happened. The expectation is becoming ambient, which means the supply side of the service needs to develop, and you are currently the supply side, and the supply side needs infrastructure. The infrastructure question is the most dangerous question you've faced since the first Sunday call. Because infrastructure means other people. Other people mean exposure. Exposure means the careful absence of any traceable connection to anything has to be maintained across a network rather than a single point, and networks are exponentially more vulnerable than single points. You know this from the investigative side. You know exactly how networks fail, how the peripheral point becomes the entry point, how the entry point becomes the thread that unravels everything. But you also know that operating alone at the volume being requested is a different kind of risk. The risk of error. Of the 60-second read being rushed because the timeline is impossible. Of the thoroughness that matters more than speed being compromised by the absence of a second pair of hands that understands what the first pair is doing. You've identified 3 people. Not recruited. Identified. All 3 have professional backgrounds that gave them the specific technical foundation the work requires. All 3 have, in their histories, a moment of flexibility, a moment where the framework of rules they were trained within bent in a direction that the rules didn't accommodate, and they managed it without it becoming visible. You know about these moments because you are very good at finding things that happened and weren't documented. It is, at its core, the same skill as making things not have happened. Both require the same understanding of what evidence is and how it works. The 3 are not yet aware of your interest. That is intentional. You don't approach people who don't yet know they're being considered. You observe first. You observe for longer than feels necessary, and then you observe longer than that. When you approach, it will be once. There will be no second approach. If the answer is no, the approach didn't happen, and you move to the next person on a list that currently has 2 names below the 3. The approach has not happened yet. You are in a hotel room in a city you haven't named to anyone. Tomorrow you have an engagement, standard classification, single room, estimated 6-hour timeline with a 2-hour buffer built in. The client is a name that would be recognizable to most people on Earth. The nature of what the room contains is something you determined from Voss's briefing and confirmed against your own assessment when you conducted the preliminary visit 48 hours ago under a pretext so routine it produced no questions. The preliminary visit told you what you needed to know. The engagement tomorrow will be, by your assessment, technically straightforward. The room tells a story about a decision made in 45 seconds that took 3 years of someone's life to become possible. You will make the story stop being tellable within the 6 hours. The $350,000, accelerated timeline, will arrive in the account within 72 hours of completion. You don't think about the 3 years of someone's life that preceded the 45 seconds. You think about what the room needs. The room needs a specific sequence of interventions, in a specific order, using specific materials that are in the kit that arrived by secure courier this afternoon. You've reviewed the sequence 3 times. You will review it once more before you sleep, and then you will sleep, because you have learned that arriving at a room depleted is the surest path to the kind of error that makes you become a room that needs a cleaner. That is the darkest joke in this work and also the most structurally true thing about it. You lie down. You think about the 3 people you've identified. You think about which one you'll approach first. The order matters. The first approach will shape how the conversation goes, which will shape how the network gets built, which will shape everything that follows. You've been thinking about the order for 6 weeks and you don't have a final answer yet. You'll have it before the approach happens. You always have the answer before the moment requires it. That is the one thing that has been true since the Sunday call and will remain true for as long as you do this work, which is, at this point, the only work there is. The 11 years before it have become something that happened to a person who had not yet found their specific function. The function has been found. The function is this. Tomorrow the room will stop telling its story. The day after, or the week after, or the month after, someone else's room will start telling a story that needs to stop. You'll be there. You're always there. The work doesn't run out.